Hello, and welcome to Fixing Ignorance, a new podcast opening conversation on the big political, psychological, and philosophical questions of our time. My name is Jake Bonetta, and I will be the host of this podcast series. Each episode, I will be joined by a few guests, my friends and colleagues, talking about facts and our opinions on massive, serious, and thought-provoking issues in a more relaxed setting than a debate. Today, we will be talking about modern education, specifically whether it is inherently broken or not. However, before we get started on that, I am joined today by Rose Diebel, Leo Godfrey, and Clara Douglas. Why don't you guys introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about you.
Hello, I'm Rose. I'm 19. I was studying psychology, maths, and English at A-levels, and I'm really interested in psychology and how the mind works, mental disorders, all of those sorts of things.
Okay, so I'm Leo Godfrey. I was in, mainstream education up until I did my GCSEs, and I'm now studying music performance at the Exeter Academy of Music and Sound. And I'm just hoping to go on to uni to do kind of the same thing. I'm a drummer and I make music.
Hi, I'm Clara. I studied English literature, RS and classics at school for A-level, and I'll be going on to study law at university. I'm just interested in ethics and interpersonal relations, specifically like family law and immigration law.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, guys. So, modern education obviously defines the education setups and institutions of our modern world and involves the methods of how we currently teach the children within our societies. For example, in the UK, education is compulsory in some form until the age of 18, from primary school up through secondary school and into sixth form colleges. University then starts with bachelor's degrees courses, usually lasting around 3 years. In terms of government spending, the UK comes in at 43rd in the world, spending 5.5% of its GDP on education, compared to the USA at 5% of their GDP. There are many ways that education has improved over the years. So guys, in what ways do you reckon modern education can be seen as good?
I definitely think that accessibility arrangements and sort of acknowledgement and accommodation of learning disabilities and other possible mental deficits which a student might suffer with, I think the accommodation of that is definitely improved.
Okay, great. Clara or Leo, do you have anything to say on that side of schools?
Well, kind of in a similar kind of vein. Also, because we have a national curriculum, it means that in general, what you learn, no matter where you're educated or what class you are expected to learn the same things, which I think it gives everyone kind of an equal starting point in some ways. It's problematic, but...
No, yeah, that's actually a really good point, to be honest, because, especially, if every different school was using different systems, it's kind of like no one's really on an equal playing field, are they? So...
No, yeah, it's like if you study history, you learn the same historical topics. And so when you go to an English university, everyone who went to an English secondary school knows the same kind of thing.
Exactly. Then there's no sense of like superiority just because of like the school you happen to go to or anything like that.
Okay, great. Yeah, obviously the UK has its own national curriculum that every state school follows. I know there are obviously other types of schools in the country. For example, you've got boarding schools, you've got free schools, you've got Church of England schools as well. I know, Rose, you spent a lot of your time outside of state education. Are there any points that you have to say in favour of your time in boarding school?
I mean, I was only at boarding school for a very short amount of time, and that's because of a lot of things that were wrong with that. So that's more a topic for later. But the school I went to before boarding school was it was like a Patreon thing, as in we were funded by the Drapers, and we also had to pay bills to go to the school. So basically it was a very rich school, and the good thing about that for the students was that there was a lot of resources. Like we had like a performing arts center, a great hall that was huge. We had like an art area which had loads of canvases, different paints, all just like loads of resources. So that wasn't government funded. It was like privately funded by the founders and the students' parents, who obviously had to pay school bills. So from that point of view, there was definitely benefits, from the sense that you weren't held back by a lack of resources, if that makes sense. Like I feel like in some schools where, you know, the funding is lower, it's sort of students and teachers alike, they're kind of inhibited by the lack of resources. Like, let's take, you know, art curriculums and stuff. When you have those loads of resources and you have the, you know, the availability of those things, it's kind of like the limit is the sky kind of thing instead, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, a lot of state schools are struggling in terms of money at the moment, but that's a point we'll get onto later. Definitely, I agree. I think private schools do have the capacity for a lot more resources within their education. Leo, I know you have studied at both state schools and non-state schools over your time in education. I was wondering if you had anything to add to the good side.
Well, on the good side, I think for me the biggest pro of modern education is the kind of array of different subjects there are. Because no matter what a student wants to do, really after GCSEs, when you can kind of narrow down exactly what you want to do, once you reach that point, you can almost do anything, and there will be a place that supports that. Even though if I'd have stayed in sixth form in my previous school, I wouldn't have been able to do music performance. There was somewhere that I found that has allowed me to do that, and I think that's true for almost anything. Say, you know, animation or graphic design or music performance as I'm doing, or even, you know, doing an apprenticeship or something. There's pathways you can go down to reach your goals for basically any field. So I think that's the biggest thing for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a very important point to state is that there is a lot more access to different strains of education, be that the arts, humanities, or subjects that you wouldn't usually take part in usual state education, let's say. For example, on the access point, if we're talking about university quickly, in the academic year 2018 to 2019, 2.28 million people were enrolled in higher education in the UK. That's a significant number of people in all of the 169 higher education providers in the UK. So, have you guys got anything else to add to the positives?
I think one final positive I would give, in terms of just like, you know, the academic system in general. So that's across, you know, all different schools and all the schools that like I personally have been to. I would say that like one reoccurring factor that definitely is better and worse in different places is a student's interest and a student's sort of passion and well-being and so on and so forth is definitely to a degree dictated by the teaching, by the actual teachers, one like the one-to-one, you know. So not just like the academic system as a whole, but the individual teachers which make that system a thing. You know, like I've had some teachers that are terrible and have like, they don't understand me whatsoever. They don't understand how I work, or, you know, how I need assistance. And then I've had other teachers that have completely changed the game for me in terms of like what I want to do with my life and how I approach school. Obviously, that's more of a topic for the negative sides, but on the positive of it, I think generally speaking, teaching as a skill, I suppose you could say, you know, the act of being in a class at the front, teaching a group of students, I think that has most definitely improved, because there's more of a passion in the teachers now than there was before.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you. I think teachers are much better trained. They also have a much better drive now than they did. I think another part of that improvement can be seen through the change in education techniques. So, for example, corporal punishment, the physical harming of a child for punishment, was very commonplace in the UK for a lot of history. And if you look at places like America, but also in the UK, there was a lot of segregation and a lot of lack of access for many kids across the education system. I think that access there has definitely improved. Leo, have you got anything to add to this?
Yeah, I also think this whole situation we're in now with coronavirus and remote learning has really highlighted how dedicated a lot of these teachers are. Obviously, some teachers are just sending out worksheets and not really doing their all. But I've seen a lot of things, because my sister's still in education, so she's getting all these online lessons, and I'm getting online lessons from my teachers. And I think it's shown that they can rise to the challenge of adapting to new environments and new challenges.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I've had teachers very similar to that through my time in education who have spent a lot of time focusing down and really helping certain students. I think it is very humbling to watch them do that. Okay, now moving on. In what ways do you guys think modern education can be seen as bad?
Oh boy.
Hold my beer.
Okay, well, we'll start with you, Clara, then.
Oh, great. Well, I think in general, the modern education system, its flaws lie in the fact that the only way that schools are judged and valued are by objective exam results, whereas everyone can recognise that education is far more about life lessons than Pythagoras. So the fact that we don't rank schools on the number of mental health facilities, for example, available to students, or the fact that even in school rankings, the statistics, like, they deceive you because they don't really explain whether or not those schools were selective in their admissions. And because the only kind of published record of a school's success is through academic performance, this then kind of puts additional pressure on all students that academic performance is the sole function of education, when in fact, like, the word education comes from the Latin educare, which is to nurture and grow and like develop you into better individuals. And I think that's something that is lacking in the way education is evaluated in society.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, actually. I think it's very interesting to see what the ancient Greeks thought, because obviously they were the pioneers of the education system. One of my favorite quotes is an Albert Einstein quote, and it goes like this: "Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid." I think that really fits the definition of our modern education system and the way that it teaches us and examines us as students, especially.
That quote is really interesting to me because it reminds me a lot of my progress through Bancroft School, because as much as there were a few positives to that school, there were definitely quite a lot of negatives, for me at least, just because of my particular circumstance. But it was really interesting because when I was in the prep school, so that's, year 7 to then 4 years after that, I was just like hated by all of my teachers. They hated me. They were like, she doesn't care about school. She doesn't listen. She doesn't try. Her handwriting is terrible. Her spelling is terrible. She's stupid. The bullying with one of my teachers got so bad. This was in French, by the way. It got so bad that I used to actually fake a stomachache every single time I would have to have a French lesson, just so I could get out of going to that French lesson. I ended up having to go to the doctors because that's how often I was like, I feel so unwell, I can't go to that lesson. And I have a really distinct memory of one time there was like a spelling test or something, and I'd completely forgotten about it. And the reason for that will become very clear very shortly. And I just cried and cried and cried. I had a panic attack because I was like, oh my God, I'm in so much, I was like, this is the end of my life. This is the end of my world. Because it was like, the teachers just did not see that it was like, I wanted to do well. I wanted to be, a good student, but I just couldn't. And I didn't know why until I was in senior school. And so that's like 5 years later, and I was in French, and I was actually apologizing to my French teacher for being so bad at her class. And she looked at me and she went, Rose, have you been tested for dyslexia? And I was like, no. And she was like, I think you should be tested for dyslexia. And it turns out that I have dyslexia. 2 years later, I was diagnosed with ADHD. A year later, I was diagnosed with autism. And so it's kind of like, well, all of those teachers from my younger years at school just completely disregarded the fact there was something else other than this student does not care. And I won't forget that fact, because it's kind of like, that school can be as good as it wants to be. It can have all the resources in the world. It can have the best results in the country. But it's kind of like, yeah, but you led me to believe that I was just a bad person and a bad student for years of my life. And that really did affect me. Like I hated going to school, and I hated being with people and going to lessons, because it was just like, I just felt like I was doing stuff wrong all the time. And it wasn't even my fault, but it felt like it was.
Yeah, no, I think personal experience is a massive factor when it comes to how education can be seen as bad, especially. I think that your experiences, Rose, they're quite damning. And it really goes to show that there are gaps in the education system that definitely need to be remedied. Leo, did you have anything to add?
We know scientifically now that there are different types of learners. So my question is, why hasn't the examination process adapted to that knowledge? Because the kind of the way we're tested, examination style is learn these things, spew them out on a page, and that's kind of it for the most part. Obviously, for some subjects it's slightly different, but that is the general gist of it. And one that doesn't work for a lot of people and tests a very specific skill, which some people are just naturally better at. And also, it's just unrealistic. When in real life are you going to need to think that way?
When are you ever going to need to have that amount of information retained in your mind at one fixated, like for one tiny period of time?
It's things like equations in physics. If you're an engineer and you forget an equation, you just look it up.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a very important point. I think it's definitely a very, very important point to make in our modern society. Obviously, the marvels of modern technology, if I may call it that, have opened up many new windows for people to learn things they wouldn't necessarily be able to learn beforehand. And that has harmed school in ways that we never could have known. It has made people aware of things at a much more advanced level intellectually than school readies us for. There's obviously the joke going around that school won't teach us about how to file our taxes or apply for a mortgage, but they'll teach us that mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell.
Oh, that classic statement.
It's true though. I'm not sure on the national curriculum as such, but personally, I have had very, very little teaching with regards to how I live my life as an adult. And I'm coming on to 18.
Yeah, 100%. Back to the national curriculum, it includes things like PSHE skills, and kind of, to some extent, the knowledge of taxes is in the maths GCSE. And I did study core maths in my AS level kind of thing, so I learnt about it. But with the way that exams are ranked, you don't do a test in social skills, you don't do a test in sex education, you don't...
Yeah, there's no like quantifying of it.
Yeah, and that's why schools don't focus on it, because there's no outward like proof that, oh, look, well, we may have had a really bad year when it comes to GCSEs, but look, these students are more compassionate. You can't measure that. So it's something called like a shrinking curriculum, where schools just ignore the things that aren't examined or things that can't be proved.
It feels like we're taught to be just like mindless workers rather than thinkers, because a lot of the skills, as I said, that are tested are just remember this thing, write it down, rather than think about how this works and explain something or come up with a new idea, do something creative.
Like adapt from that base sort of idea. You're given this general thing, and then it's kind of like, all right, create something with that. There's no sense of that, is there?
No, exactly.
I remember one time I was in English, and someone was complaining that it was really cold in the room. And so they went to the radiator. They were like, oh, the radiator's cold. And I was like, oh, it probably needs bleeding. And I just remember like a sea of people looking at me like, what the hell are you talking about? I was like, do you not know what bleeding a radiator is? And the only reason I knew what it was because I had to have my radiator bled like the first night that I was at boarding school. And I remember watching my housemaster do it and me being like, what are you doing? And him explaining it to me. That wasn't a lesson. That was just an interaction between two people. And yet I learned something that is, quite useful. And yeah, it's like, you have so many people in our generation that don't know how to do these things, and it's really easy for like marketing to sort of take advantage of that and be like, we can help you make it all easy, and we can be in taking charge. And it's kind of like, well, you can pay someone to do that for you, but it's sort of we have the capability to be able to do that sort of stuff ourselves, but it's kind of, because it's not taught, we are then pushed out into the big wide world with a lack of those sorts of skills, and it's kind of like, well, who picks up the pieces? I don't know. I just think it's quite bad.
No, I completely agree with you there. I think a very important point, which links quite heavily into what we're taught at school, the national curriculum, are the spending cuts that have been taking place across the board in education in the UK specifically. For example, in a poll of UK school leaders by the Head Teachers Union, the National Association of Head Teachers, 65% of school leaders in the country said that they strongly agreed that cutbacks have already had a negative impact on the performance of their school. On top of that, only 8% of the respondents to that survey said that they did not foresee a year where they would have an untenable deficit. I think that's a massive point to make, and it's pretty damning on the way that education has been treated over the last 10 or 15 years. Do any of you guys have anything to add to that?
I think it's tragically ironic that school and government and all of that, it's like they put getting a good education and getting a good job on this massive pedestal, and then they're like, oh, but we're going to cut the funds for that thing that we're telling you is really important and that you need. It seems like biting off your nose to smite your own face. It's kind of like, what? It doesn't seem logical.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I, as everyone knows, I'm quite political. I have my thoughts on this, on austerity especially, but I'm not going to get into that today. I think that would be a bit too controversial. Clara or Leo, do you have anything to add to the negatives of modern education?
I have some personal experience with this next point, which is I never felt encouraged to do what I felt passionate about, which I think is a big issue for a lot of people. And my story to go along with this is at my school we had a careers advisor come in, and I recognize that that's a third party person, but the school did bring them in, so I think anything they say is kind of reflective of the school environment. And so this guy asked me, so what do you want to do with your life? And I told him, I want to be a drummer. That's what I want to do. And he told me, just choose something that's more realistic. Evidently, I didn't do that, and I've gone down the path of being a drummer. But I think a lot of people would have been kind of taken aback by that and think, oh, maybe I do need to just think about doing something a bit more realistic. And I don't think that's healthy, because living with regret is such a big issue. If you think you should do something and someone just tells you, they just wave it off, they just say, no, choose something more realistic, I think that's going to damage a lot of people who want to do something but then just don't feel like it's a viable option.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you. As Leo, I'm also a drummer. I've been drumming for, nearly 10 years now, I think. And because obviously we know each other quite well, Leo. We've been in school together since we were in year 7 until obviously sixth form. I very, very nearly followed you to music school because I was in the same boat of, do I want to do something that I'd like to do as a hobby, as a career? I settled on the other side of the argument purely for my other interests in politics and international relations and other things, but I can completely see where you're coming from. Mainstream state education does not encourage you to follow exactly what you want. It encourages you to follow the A level in exactly what you want.
Yeah, I think they wanted to keep me in that kind of mainstream ecosystem.
Because it's almost easier, It seems like that it's like, oh, it's easier if we just make them all go down this path. So let's just push them into there,
Yeah, well, the way that the British education system works, specifically in terms of subjects, obviously at secondary school you are taught a base set of subjects. You get a little bit of choice whether you want to do one of the arts or humanities or something like that, but all of the STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and maths, pretty much are compulsory. When you get to A level, you can obviously go off and you can do BTECs, you can do vocational courses, apprenticeships. But the way that the state education system works is it will try and keep you in those basic subjects. It is cheaper for schools to teach those subjects because they'll have bigger classes at the end of the day.
It's like, sardines in a tin, make the classes as big as possible.
Yeah, which is another point. I think the average class size for lower secondary school at the moment is somewhere between 20 and 30, which is a massive increase over the last 50 years. Does anyone else have anything to add to the negatives?
kind of in reference to the kind of stifling of passion within school. Not only is it bad for your mental health, but also it's detrimental to your performance in a subject. And the OECD, which is the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, found that reading for pleasure has more influence than your socio-economic background on your final exam results. And it just shows that students that genuinely love their subjects can kind of overcome any societal ill, perhaps. And it's kind of sad that that's not being recognised and encouraged.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point to add. If you are passionate about your subject, you are, in a way, very inclined to go on and do it well because you want to do it. If you're not so passionate about it, if you're being forced into it, into a curriculum that you don't quite understand, you don't quite get, you don't quite like, you're not going to be as efficient at it.
I failed my German GCSE. I absolutely despised doing that subject. My teachers knew that, all my peers knew that, my parents knew that, and I was getting terrible results all the way through, even though I really was trying. You can't force yourself to do well in something that you have zero passion for.
Whereas, and I'll use an example from my own personal life here, on the absolute other end of the spectrum, in my drama GCSE, drama being the thing that I love the most in the world, I absolutely adore everything to do with it. I got a 7 at GCSE. I know saying that 7 is a low grade is really bad, but for me, having my personal favourite thing lower than my most hated subject in the world, chemistry, that really goes to show that there is something wrong with the way it's taught. Okay, does anyone else have anything to add to the negatives?
I have a small thing. Obviously, like I can not talk about it, but I in terms of the when you were talking about the careers advisor saying pick something more plausible. I remember like all of my teachers being like, yeah, no, she won't get into a university. Like she wouldn't be able to handle university, and literally it was just because I had all of these issues that either weren't being accommodated or weren't being identified. Now it's like, well, I've firmed a university and I've gone to that university loads of times, and they are putting all of these access arrangements in place because it's like, just because of these problems in quotes that I have, it's kind of like that doesn't mean I have any less right to further my education if that's what I want to do. And it wasn't until I found psychology that I actually wanted to do that, because before then I was just like, do you know what, I hate this. I hate school, I hate this environment, I hate teachers, I hate the way that I'm just never good at anything no matter how hard I try. And it's kind of like, when I found that as my passion, it was like, yeah, that is what I want to do, that is what I'm going to do. And it's interesting that a couple of years ago, a completely different environment, and it was like, yeah, no, she couldn't survive, she just wouldn't be able to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important point to add. Obviously, as I said earlier, personal experience is a massive factor in this. So thank you very much for saying your personal experience, guys, in this. Now, I think we should probably move on to the last point of the day. And that is, how do you think modern education can be improved? So why don't we start with Clara?
I was reading a book about education and the education system, and I was reading about how in Finland they've kind of rebranded teaching and kind of revitalized the career to make it seem more appealing, and how this has actually improved students' experiences of school. For example, I think Leo was talking earlier about the research that's been done in the different forms of learning and the different ways people learn. And in Finland, teachers are encouraged, like doctors are and lawyers are in the UK, to continue researching innovations within their subject and innovations in teaching and applying that to the classroom. And so I think that's a way of like making sure school remains dynamic and kind of moving with the times and being able to aid every student, because they're constantly trying to become aware of new scientific literature on certain topics.
Yeah, absolutely. As you'll know, Clara, Finland has consistently been ranked as having the best education system in the world. And it's easy to see that from our perspective, why that would be. such. They, as you said, have very much made most education more like university, carrying on your love for the subject whilst also teaching others about it. But also, an interesting thing to add, I don't think they have national standardized examinations until the age of 16. Whereas in the UK, our first national standardized exams are in year 2 at the age of 6. So it's definitely something to show there. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
I think that it is very important to try and broaden participation, because I've worked with a lot of SEN students, which is students with special educational needs, and it's quite heartbreaking sometimes seeing how they're like, I can't do that, and they weren't born thinking they can't do it. They've been told that they can't, and it's upsetting when it's like, who has the right to sort of take that away from someone, take away that, that possibility of future, furthering education.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another point to add, actually, quickly, that I was quite pleased to see by our government. They announced something, I can't remember how long ago, but they announced a new subject string called T levels. So basically, they will be equivalents to A levels, studied at the same time as A levels, and they will be in vocational things like accounting, agriculture, craft and design, human resources, on-site construction and media, stuff like that, equivalent to A levels. I think that's quite an important improvement to see in terms of the education system. It will just be interesting to see how they will go about standardizing it, which is, I think, where its downfall will be. Okay, does anyone have anything to add to the improvements?
One thing that I think would be a vast improvement is I think students should be kind of listened to more about what they really are passionate about and want to do beyond GCSEs, and even during GCSEs, really, because obviously we have careers advisors and we have brief meetings with teachers a lot of the time saying what subjects you want to take for A level and things, but I don't think the question should be what subject do you want to take for A level. It should be, what do you want to do with your life? How can we facilitate that? And if we can't facilitate that, how are we going to enable you or guide you into a path that you can achieve that? So obviously certain schools, they won't be able to do, I'll use my example, a music performance thing, but why can't teachers and members of staff guide students to places where they can facilitate that?
This reminds me, because I was deputy head girl at my school, and we were kind of sent in to do an assembly to all the year 11s on why they should stay, and basically we were told to tell them we offered them anything they wanted even though we didn't. And I just thought that was so sad, because we're essentially conning them out of other opportunities just so that we can have more people in our sixth form. And I thought that was really sad that we weren't nurturing certain people. And I know some of my friends that want to do gap years weren't encouraged to do that because they were going to do great in A levels and they should just apply to university to make the school look better. Or other people in my friendship group who were told, actually, don't apply to university. We don't think you should go. And I just thought that it was quite sad that school was holding people back from what they want to do.
Yeah, I think that is symptomatic of a wider epidemic across the entire school system, looking at the way it is funded. Going back to that point, obviously, schools are standardized through examination results and they are ranked that way, and also through progression to university. So the way that schools are seen in the eyes of other people is very much flawed when it comes to the student. Because if a student isn't necessarily as good at a subject as they think they could be, but they still like it, a school is going to be more likely to turn around and say, we don't think you should apply to this at university, because they want themselves to look good. They want the funding. But at the same time, schools need to get as many students as possible because of the way that schools are funded. Schools are funded on a per pupil basis, especially secondary schools. So looking at how schools are funded, where the funding is allocated, but also how schools behave towards their students would be an interesting thing to look at, definitely around improving the school system. Does anyone else have anything to add to the improvements that could be made?
Just continued access, I guess, really, because although schools now are more secular than ever before, and that we're not segregated by race or gender, and also by law, like English schools have to kind of preach a liberal education, whereas in countries like Italy, they have to have a crucifix in the classroom. Like by law, you must have a crucifix in most public buildings in Italy, whereas we live in a more secular society and in more secular schools. But I do feel like societally, school is kind of still oppressive in some ways. And like to add to another horrific kind of career advisor experience, I remember in like year 10 saying to my career advisor, I want to be a lawyer. And he said, okay, but it's an all boys club. It's an all boys club. It's really going to be really difficult for you to be a lawyer. And then I remember coming back in year 12 and going, actually, I'm going to be a judge. And his reaction got even more like, well, that's even more of an all boys club. And I don't think you can do that as a female. It's going to be more difficult for you. And I just think we need to continue to be aware of the fact that schools, although perhaps by law have to be very accessible, the language and the way teachers or other members of staff approach issues is still quite problematic.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually, talking about progression outside of school. Surely schools or people that they bring in should be helping you to do what you want and helping to fight these inequalities. Surely. Leo, did you have anything to add?
I don't have anything to add to that specific point, but I have an improvement. I think the country as a whole needs to really sit down and think about how the education system, when it comes to exams, has to change, because it does have to change. Because I just think it's holding so many people back, because exams just aren't for everyone. I know I do much better when I'm doing coursework, which I can see through even my the grades I'm getting at the moment, because on my current course I'm doing all coursework and I'm doing better than I ever have before. And I think some people's brains just are more suited to that kind of style of working. And exams, one, they put too much pressure on people, because this whole course you've done over the course of however many years is culminating in this one event. And if that just goes wrong, that's it. And as I said before, it just doesn't make sense for certain people.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. Has anyone else got anything to add to the improvements that could be made?
I think just generally, funding in places which, because like, I know I keep talking about SEN, but like, I suppose it's just because I see quite a lot of it. And, in Colleton, we have one teacher really who is sort of responsible for having one-on-one meetings with all the children who are SEN, which is far too, like, it's spreading someone too thin like that. It's not good. I think funding and allocation of resources, I think that, just generally would be a good improvement.
No, absolutely. I agree with you completely. Okay, I think that pretty much finishes our conversation for today's episode. I think we've pretty much covered everything there. So thank you all for coming along and getting involved.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, that wraps up today's episode of Fixing Ignorance. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation on modern education and have taken at least one useful bit of information away from this. We will be recording and releasing 2 episodes a week during the COVID-19 pandemic, and you can listen to them as they come out on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, and all other major streaming platforms. I've been your host, Jake Bonetta. If you want, you can keep up to date with my political shenanigans and this podcast on Twitter @Jake Bonetta. See you next time, where we'll look at another big question with a new collection of voices. Thanks for listening.